Okay, here we are. Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming to this talk. Sorry for the very brief delay. So just a quick rundown of how this works. If this happens to be your first talk of the day, there will be a 20-minute talk, lecture, and then 20 minutes for Q&A. So you can submit your questions. At the bottom of the screen, there's a button that says Ask a Question. We prefer you to do it there as opposed to in the chat room, but I'll be here monitoring the questions, so wherever you post them, I will find them. All right, so I'm going to pass it off to Eugene, and great, I'm out of here. Take it away.
Thanks, Ray.
You got it.
So, and I'll try to keep it a bit under 20 so we could still try to stay on time. Sorry that we were running a little late, folks. My name is Eugene Leventhal. I'm the host of the History of Drugs and Society podcast, and today we're going to talk about some drug policy and what are some of the hidden voices that result from it. And to start talking about what people think of when they hear the word drugs, for some individuals that might be thinking of direct substances, whether it's cannabis, opioids, cocaine, meth, mushrooms, LSD, MDMA. There's a laundry list of substances that we hear through culture, through news, etc. Some people might think of famous traffickers, whether it's Pablo Escobar or El Chapo or some of the shows that are inspired by them. Others might think of the war on drugs or the policy responses that have resulted from them. Some might even think of their own usage or the usage within their friend group or the impacts that drugs have had on their community. But regardless of what comes to mind, the reality is that many people's voices aren't heard and are not factored into the decisions of drug policy. And many people's lives end up getting tremendously impacted by drug markets and the policies that are meant to, especially on the supply side of drugs, meant to decrease those. Before we get into the actual policy goals, I do just want to kind of lay the foundation that it's very important to note that from the outset of US drug policy, which started taking shape in the late 1800s, there have been multiple racial and moralistic components to the policies. The first laws were actually against some of the Chinese immigrants, Chinese laborers who were working in the West Coast and around San Francisco, though it wasn't exclusively around there, but that's where the first laws started coming up in the 1870s and 80s. And as we got into the closer to the 1900s, and as drug usage started shifting from wealthier middle to upper class, especially women were using greater at that point, partially due to the marketing nature of patent medicine, as that usage started shifting away from them to younger, poorer men from all kinds of different backgrounds, laws really started changing suit as well in those first 2 decades. And by the 1920s, between the Harrison Narcotics Act, which sort of laid the foundation of modern drug policy, and 2 Supreme Court decisions that followed shortly thereafter, the general approach towards total prohibition and applying a punitive mindset have been put in place roughly since then. And starting from that point, people like Harry Anslinger, who was involved in alcohol prohibition, who became the first director of the Bureau of Narcotics, individuals like him would really help carry that mentality forward into the 1970s when Richard Nixon would really crank things up a notch with the war on drugs. And so turning to drug policy, what are the overall generalized options that we can think of? If we think of it as a dichotomy, on the one end, abstinence and total prohibition as mentioned. But what really lies at the other end? Is it that people should just be allowed to take whatever they want? Well, what does that end up really meaning from a policy perspective? Is the goal to decrease the amount of people taking drugs? Is it to decrease the amount of drugs being taken? If it's either one of those, how do you determine the level and why? And who gets to decide those levels? Or is the goal to simply have less people dying, at least initially? And so if that's the goal, then something like harm reduction 100% makes a lot of sense. And all of the things that I've mentioned so far, and pretty much everything I've been talking about for the last 4 or so minutes, has all assumed that drugs are inherently illegal. And it's very fair to ask the question of, does that even have to be the case in the first place? On the one hand, there's the question of decriminalization, especially when it comes to possession. If I as an individual have some minuscule amount of cannabis or any other narcotic, or any other drug, should I be penalized for that? Should I maybe be given a citation? Should I be left alone? Or if anything, should I be pointed towards social and health resources? That's great because it could limit the amount of people who are who are incarcerated in general. And there are some models in the world, such as Portugal, which have combined sort of some of the decriminalization and as well as increasing harm reduction. And we see pretty good results overall across the board. It's important to note, though, that illegal markets do still exist in that environment. If we shift over to the question of full-on legalization, I'm going to start off with one of the more worrying options in my mind, which is full privatized legalization of any drug. I really don't like the idea of Philip Morris selling cannabis, of Mick cocaine, or of any other corporation really getting into and applying their traditional mentality towards substances such as drugs. Another part of this that worries me and that we're already seeing play out on the cannabis side is many of those individuals who are heavily affected by previous drug laws are not being factored into the process of building out this legal industry. And actually, a lot of those individuals who have felony charges might be totally excluded from those opportunities, and that's a big problem in of itself. When looking at other forms of legalization, there could also be regulated legalization, which is pretty much the idea that the government would put sort of constraints on how companies can operate, but it's still going to be private industry. The government can fully control it, which I just don't see happening in the United States of America anytime soon. I don't see legalization happening anytime soon, but especially a full government-run operation. Another model that I would love to see more experimentation with is the club model that has kind of emerged in Spain, which has pretty much gotten to the point where the decriminalization laws there are such that I can grow some cannabis on my property for myself. I still can't sell, around sharing things it's a bit of a gray area, but I at least can't sell it beyond my home and myself. And the club model is, well, what if a few people come together and effectively form a cooperative where they all work together to grow the weed, which they all then consume themselves within their community? That is a model that has been working in Spain. And there have been, as research has shown, some good indicators around that. But there are other issues, especially just with the current legal status of cannabis in many places. But again, I would very much love to see some experimentation with this kind of model, whether it's for cannabis or other substances. And also, just to apologize in case there's any noise creep, I live on a very quiet street, but I've heard a number of very large trucks drive by. So I feel like someone's going to have construction or some work. So apologies if there's any background noise. The last drug policy that I want to put forth is one that we're not really going to get into much, but the basic idea, the first time I came across it was in Don Pali's book, Drug War Capitalism, and it puts forth the thought that, especially in the context of Mexico-US relations and drug policy, certain actions taken by the Mexican government, and not to isolate them to say this is a unique example, but there may be instances where decisions are made to maximize foreign direct investment in economic development as opposed to any kind of social goals. So it is very important to understand that drug policy is much more complex than just the idea of there are people who use a substance, how do we take care of them? Unfortunately, between morality, finances, and so many other topics, it is a much more complicated question. And it's important to note that drug markets don't happen in isolation. Throughout the Cold War, the war on communism always trumped the war on drugs when it came to US politics and backdoor dealings, especially. Drug trafficking organizations frequently work in other areas of illegal activity. And in the question of legalization, what happens to these trafficking organizations? Do they start diversifying, more focusing on other illegal areas, or do they try to legally go into these new legal drug markets? And that is a very important question that it needs to be thought through. And also, in terms of drug markets not taking place in isolation, any community, especially when there's poor support from the medical or harm reduction perspective for users, and there's challenging financial circumstances in those environments, crime can rise, and there have been many times when it has risen. And overall, poverty, crime, demographics, all of these things are themselves a result of many years of previous policy decisions and social and cultural actions. So it's not as though we can just look at drugs in isolation. And especially when it comes to the addiction side, the prison system in the US is the largest mental health provider. And that is pretty indicative, in my opinion, of the fact that our country does not have the institutional support for mental health, whether it's for addiction or mental health more broadly. And so now let's look at some case studies where we can look at some very specific examples. And again, who have really been the folks who are most affected by those policies. And we'll start on the supply side, specifically looking at supply reduction in the form of eradication. And so in the 1990s, Colombia was going through a lot of change. Pablo Escobar, that whole story going through the 80s into 93 until he was killed by state forces. That era started seeing a very big increase in the cultivation of coca in Colombia. And between 1994 to 2000, the percent of the market that Colombian cocaine made up, at least in terms of cultivation, went from 22%, just under a quarter of the market, to 70%, so almost 3/4 of the market. So that is a huge amount of change. And as part of that, the US government decided to send over $4 billion initially, but it ended up growing much more, to Colombia to fight narco trafficking in what became known as Plan Colombia. Very creative nomenclature. And even the State Department pretty quickly started having reports that showed that cultivation was continuing just within Colombia despite the eradication efforts. And the balloon effect, which is the idea that, I mean, if anyone squeezed a balloon, you press on one side, it just pops up in the other, air just gets relocated, it doesn't disappear within a confined space. So the balloon effect in the drug market is the same idea. If you squeeze one drug market, it's not as though that demand or supply of drugs totally disappears permanently. It's probably just going to shift because the demand has stayed the same. So suppliers will find a way to get that out. And also very important to note is that the aerial spraying of the kind of herbicides used tremendously affects local agriculture to the point where it was referred to in at least one paper I read as it was effectively large-scale weed whacking. And despite the spraying of over 140,000 hectares in 2005, cultivation increased by 8%. So all that we're seeing over time is that the production hasn't increased, or excuse me, the production has increased. Meanwhile, a lot of the most negative effects from these campaigns are actually felt by rural Colombians who are displaced either by these direct campaigns, eradication, fumigation, etc., or by the violence that arises around them. The Council of Human Rights and Displacement estimated that in 2001 and 2002, just between those 2 years, fumigation displaced more than 75,000 people across the country. And this is a group of people, and 85% of rural Colombians live below the poverty line. They're a group of people who are losing out because they lose their home, they lose their traditional chance at work because all the crops have just been destroyed, whether or not they were growing coca. And when we think of the drug market overall, the US market for cocaine is roughly a $35 billion market. The farmers at the end of the day make less than 1%, all of the collective farmers. I think it's roughly 70% stays in the US, 1% goes to the farmers, and everything in between kind of pays off bribes and then the traffickers and manufacturers. But the voices of the farmers and their families are rarely heard. Their stories are frequently not covered on the news. They're rarely glorified in any kind of TV show the way Narcos looks at some of the drug traffickers. And resources are rarely available for support for the farmers and their families to avoid becoming just collateral damage in these kind of campaigns to fight the traffickers. Another very important aspect of drug markets is the violence that happens, because that itself leaves a tremendous amount of voices hidden and lost forever, unfortunately. Drug trafficking organizations frequently recruit from the kind of communities that may not be facing any better financial opportunities. And a lot of the time they prey on the most vulnerable individuals in terms of both recruiting and also just using for various parts of their operations. And drug violence is also tremendously complex. There's a great book, The Politics of Drug Violence by Angelica Duran Martinez, where she discusses some of the components, whether it's the frequency and the visibility and the interaction of the state and the armed forces and the market to all come together to really set up the incentive structure for people to decide whether or not to commit to be violent in drug markets in the first place. Unfortunately, due to time, we won't get to dig into that much. But I do want to jump over to the demand side and talk about users for a moment, because I think in the context of users, their families, their communities, way too many voices get left unheard, both in the context of policy decision-making and in terms of just social awareness. Drug stigmatization is still a very big problem. And so on the user side, I think first of all, it's important to note that the drug war in the US, or war on drugs in the US, is inextricably linked with mass incarceration in the US. And both of these have disproportionately affected Black and Latino communities. one of the more striking examples of this was kind of following the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 that established mandatory minimum sentences for certain qualities of cocaine. Within a few years, I think it was within 2 years, Congress had made it so that punishments for crack were even more severe. So if I got caught selling 5 grams of crack, I would get 5 years in jail or prison. Whereas if I got selling 500 grams of powder cocaine, I would get the same sentence. Even though it's been found and proven since that crack is no more harmful than cocaine, it's the same drug consumed 2 different ways. And this generally fits into the trend that policies such as these, stop and frisk in New York and countless others, have contributed to countless people being in jails, hundreds of thousands of people being in jails or prisons for possession charges, and the total 20 million plus cumulative felons that we have in the US as a result of some of these policies. And considering that those who are at higher risk for overdose can often have issues accessing traditional healthcare system in the US, harm reduction should be much more prevalent, but is still kind of shockingly hard to get in many places. In 2017, roughly 271 million people across the globe used illegal drugs, and 35 million of those people are estimated to suffer with some form of drug addiction. And at the same time, in the US specific, the war on drugs has cost US taxpayers over $1 trillion since 1971. In 2017, cocaine hit all-time record productions. Opioids hit the same a number of times in the last decade. Drug overdoses in the United States reached a new peak in that year of 70,000 just in a single year. And there are worrying trends across a variety of different substances. So by all measures, the drug war is a failure. And yet no one is seriously rethinking these kinds of policies, even though we've seen in the last 20 years, almost 770,000 people die from drug overdoses. And when we think of the kind of policies that we can easily support more so, supporting things like naloxone, which was an FDA-approved opioid overdose reversal drug created in 1971 with no shown potential for misuse, that is still tougher to get than it should be and still needs to go through prescribers in many places. And there's also moralistic tensions where certain individuals will believe that by once I've resuscitated a person for the 10th, 15th, 20th time, I'm just promoting their drug use. This isn't good to society. And that is one moralistic view that has arisen in certain areas where drug overdoses are rampant and naloxone has become more available. There's also needle exchanges that need to become more popular, give people more clean supplies, especially because we've seen, whether through drugs or through the HIV epidemic in the 90s or from the 80s into the early 2000s, that doing safe injection, giving clean needles is a tremendous way to help individuals not die from infectious diseases. And the number has doubled roughly from 200 to 400, going from roughly 2014, 15 to today, but there's still a lot more that can be done. There's also safe injection sites, which is great that San Francisco recently approved a program, but we'll still have to see how that's going to play out. Medication-assisted treatment, the idea of giving methadone or buprenorphine and potentially even heroin-assisted treatment, the idea that giving certain opioids in regulated environments, in controlled environments, can be a way to help them manage and healthily live with their addiction. And all of these challenges on the harm reduction side have been escalated by COVID-19. So when it comes to the right policy, I think harm reduction is a no-brainer. I personally do think that decriminalization of possession is a very important thing. On the legalization side, I think there's a lot of things which theoretically sound great in terms of crime-free drug supply chains, more predictable potency for users, less of a penal component. But I'm personally very worried about what happens to a number of these illegal drug trafficking organizations if and when we were to switch to a truly legal global regime. And that would be a great point of tension that needs more research and thought instead of just bulldozing into full legalization. And that's where especially I think decriminalization is a fantastic thing that we don't need to wait much time for because the evidence is already there. And so in the end, not only are most drug users themselves unheard and their voices underrepresented, but the same is true for their families and communities. And history has shown that when there are occurrences and things get bad enough, such as the opioid crisis in the US, all the deaths from drugs in Mexico, more voices can be heard, but it's still not enough to meaningfully change policy. So hopefully this will encourage you all to learn a bit more about these kind of policies to see where you can potentially affect very locally and who are the right people to vote for. And if you're in a position to financially support as well, it's always great to find a local harm reduction nonprofit because they're pretty much all grossly understaffed and underfunded. But I'll cut it off there just to leave some time for a Q&A. Thank you for joining.
Okay, great. So we have a question from Christops. Have you explored the drug situation in the EU? What steps do you think countries should take to help legalize weed, for example?
Yeah, so admittedly, in general, I have not been as heavily focused on cannabis as I have been on opioids and some of the quote unquote harder drugs. But in general, yes, I have started looking at more European markets as well. I actually had the privilege of interviewing the head of the European drug agencies, their head of markets recently, about how COVID has specifically impacted markets. But, you know, I think that on the one hand, Europe has been much more open-minded towards harm reduction policies. I mean, in Spain with decriminalization and the growing clubs, in Portugal, as mentioned, and they're also much bigger on safe injection sites, on giving clean supply. There's much more open-mindedness towards that. Switzerland is another one where they've had safe injection sites and clean supply offered to, and medication-assisted treatment. And a lot of these policies can bring up a lot of tension. And I know close to or in your part of the world, they're a bit north of you in Estonia, you know, they've been having their own fentanyl crisis since 2001. And Estonia is actually the longest standing opioid crisis dealing with such an intensity as they have been. And there's a lot of interesting elements that can be unpacked in terms of why that came up. But specifically in terms of what steps do I think countries should take to help legalize substances? I mean, I think the biggest thing in my mind, again, is, well, harm reduction on the cannabis side is a little bit different. There should be more mental health services and the like, but that fits into a bigger mental health conversation. But especially for opioids, cocaine, meth, any kind of substance where there is a risk of overdose, I think harm reduction is a no-brainer. And decriminalization of possession also has some really strong evidence that it is a useful policy. And I have not come across much reputed evidence that shows that decriminalization actually has negative social effects. The one that I've seen pointed to a few times, with Portugal being an example, is that when you do decriminalize, when you create a more relaxed drug environment, drug use might tick up a bit. There have been some instances of this after cannabis legalization in certain states around the US, that there is an initial uptick. What we have yet to see over a long period of time is, does that uptick really lead to the growth of addicted users? Or, you know, in the context of cannabis, is that, you know, X percent more people who have tried it once and are never going to use it again? And those are some very important distinctions. And from what I remember, and I didn't review the research before this, but from what I remember of the research in Portugal is there was an initial spike up, but it did level out. It's not as though the level of usage is just increases and stay flat. So yeah, I think starting with increased harm reduction, increased decriminalization of possession especially, and from there just having more serious research efforts, and ideally more open research efforts, I think can kind of set the stage so that within a few years we can actually have a good plan. Because I think that things are in such disarray right now that no one in the world is close enough to be in the position where they can have a good plan to fully legalize, because there's just so much of a mess in the middle due to, you know, a century's worth of questionable policies. I see another question came up with, how can we shut down arguments that we actually need to fight on drugs, the war on drugs, more vigorously? That is a great question. I mean, it depends on the nature of the discussion and who you're talking to, right? But if your discussion is coming from any kind of rational point, you know, I think that when you ask someone just bluntly of, in your opinion, if you spent $1 trillion on something with the intention of having less people use less drugs in America and less people die, supposedly, right? Those are the supposed social sort of performance indicators that we would want to assess the war on drugs by, though that can be heavily argued. But let's give the benefit of the doubt to Nixon and all the people who started it, even though it's been shown openly that there were racial components to their decisions of specific policy. But again, let's pretend they did have society's best interest in mind. And if you're coming at it from that perspective, I don't understand how you can say that after spending $1 trillion with more people dying, with more of just about every single substance in existence being more readily available, now especially, we didn't touch on the dark web and the ability to buy almost any substance and have it shipped to your home or a PO box or something like that, right? And in just a mind-blowing amount of people dying, right? In the US, if I remember the number correctly, it was roughly 500,000, a bit under 500,000 people died total in terms of World War II. And we've had 770,000 people die in just about 20 years just from drug overdoses, in a lot of situations with very preventable deaths. So, I mean, I think if someone's coming at you from the moralistic perspective of, I think drugs are bad, I don't agree with drug use, I abstain from alcohol and tobacco too, right? Because those two substances kill a ton of people as well. And in a world of true prohibition and abstinence, they would absolutely be illegal as well. If you're having objective research-based prohibition, like that were to ever happen. But, I do think if you just ask those individuals honestly of like, okay, well, if you think drugs are bad, what's worse to you? Having all of these things just get worse, or at least having less people die? And for me, it just comes down to that, especially on the decriminalization and harm reduction side, is that and you could also argue that, especially on the decriminalization perspective, that's going to be less of a burden on the state in the long run. That's not my main focus of it. For me, I care about the human side of it more so than anything else. But you can't ignore the fact that the all-time costs that are going to be associated with putting someone in jail and effectively pulling them out of it, if they're getting a felony, out of the fully functioning political economy overall in the US, I don't see how one can argue that those are good outcomes. And I would love to see the evidence that they could come up for that argument. So yeah, I mean, I think that just getting them to honestly admit of like, just admit that you morally have an issue with drugs and you don't want to consider anything outside of that. And that might be as best as you can get if they're not actually willing to listen to data. I see another comment that came up. If we adopted the policy you seem to espouse, we would likely end up with a large number of drug users not really contributing anything to society. That doesn't do much for the dignity of those people on maintenance either, does it? Right. So that is an argument that is frequently, I don't want to say frequently, I don't have the numbers on that, but that is an argument that is definitely espoused against the idea of anything that kind of allows more usage. And from a moralistic perspective, I guess I can kind of see where that thought is coming from. But I mean, at the end of the day, I don't get why, just from a pure moralistic perspective, I do not get how one can argue that cannabis should be illegal, but tobacco and alcohol are. By all kinds of public health indicators, the latter two are much more dangerous than cannabis. Yes, there's the idea that we're going to have a bunch of these freeloaders, but if I'm not mistaken, since and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure Colorado's economy has benefited from the legalization of cannabis, and there have been no signs of increased unemployment. There have been no signs of a greater burden on the system in terms of more people trying to use social services or anything like that. There's a great book, Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari, and he gives some interviews that he had with folks in Switzerland who are going through methadone-assisted treatment, and even possibly even some who get legal heroin. And pretty much what he was showing through his research is that there are some papers that indicate that up to 90% of users might not actually be full-on addicted users, right? When we think of a heroin user, we immediately think of someone with a needle stuck in their arm drifting off, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that there are a fair number of opioid users, and we have no way of knowing what the exact number is, but there are a significant number of opioid users who are functioning individuals. I myself know quite a fair number of people who might even struggle with addiction or very regularly consume substances, and they contribute a ton to society. Having worked related to Wall Street for a while, I can tell you for sure that, and having met a fair amount of people in corporate law too, Wall Street and all of the legal firms surrounding there have no shortage of drug use amongst those organizations. So I see what you're saying, and I get where that's coming from. But if we look at something like the opioid crisis that started, with the beginnings in Appalachia, the social problems around lack of work, around lack of social programs when individuals don't have work. A lot of people were going on medical benefits, long-term medical benefits from an injury, just because they had no alternative ways of getting finances, and they had no other ways to just get by. So, those kinds of problems that are, mentioned in Bullying Alone by Roger Putnam, and some of these other social changes that were taking place can greatly contribute. But again, there's very limited evidence of the argument that you're saying. And the reality is that there are no shortage of places in the world that have slackened drug laws in the last 50 years. And, by that kind of logic, how does the Netherlands function? How does anywhere with any kind of, how does Uruguay, Uruguay, fine, is a much smaller economy. You can make counter arguments there, whatever. But, yeah, Netherlands, I don't think anyone will look at the Netherlands and say that they are a lazy, non-producing country. And I've had the chance to visit there a few times and, just speak to locals about the culture and environment around it. And there is also just the chance that, if we snap our fingers and magically make the world at least decriminalized, if not legalized, there is a chance that people just approach these substances the same way people might approach bars or other places or venues or other decisions where there is a potential point of self-harm. But as an educated individual who has freedom of rights, I get to choose whether or not I want to harm myself. And especially if these substances have supply chains where there are less people getting hurt. With cocaine, one of the challenges of justifying even anything around cocaine is the fact that until you figure out a way to have, clean, death-free supply, somebody died getting that cocaine to America. And so, but that's very different with cannabis. A lot of the time now, even on the illegal market, if you're buying cannabis, there's a lot more of it coming from America. Someone grew it a couple of states over, or, an hour from your house, and they know someone, it's through much more peaceful networks. Let me see, I saw you had a follow-up. I would argue with you on alcohol and tobacco being worse, but once we have a problem, we can't get rid of it. Prohibition. Better be sure. Yeah, again, but for me, it's also, the beginnings of the opioid crisis started with legal prescription, right? Unless you're going for a very strict overhaul of our entire capitalistic system and looking at all of the things where individuals are negatively affected and heavily decreasing them, yeah, I get where you're coming from, but I don't see the evidence to say that makes sense unless we want to move to a more authoritarian world where, and maybe authoritarian isn't the right word, but unless we want to move to a world where government or powers that be are the ones that prescribe us what is morally okay and not okay. Because at the end of the day, yeah, there's famous people who have contributed a lot to society. Thomas Jefferson grew opium on his farm, and he was trying to get that industry started here. I'm not going to run through the list now, but there's no shortage of people who are very much lauded in history and oft overlooked of the fact that they were proper drug users. So, yeah, there is no right answer here. And I do appreciate you pushing back, Edward, because I do think these are very important questions. And the last thing I want to imply is to say that, I figured it out and I have the right answer. And, there is no right answer, because on an individual basis, we all have different understandings of what is okay and not okay for other people to be doing. And how do you generalize that to a population, right? It's very challenging to just have a quote unquote right drug policy, as we see with all policies. But yeah, given that I don't see any other questions.
We do have one more question.
No, I'm sorry, we do.
In the Ask a Question bar, which is actually my question, which is, okay. What do you think is the American resistance to steps toward harm reduction, like culturally, historically? Why are we more resistant to that than other countries?
I think a big part of it does really come from. Well, I'm not a cultural historian, and I'm not even a proper historian. I have a finance and policy background, and I've only been in this world for a couple of years. So I don't, from my understanding of it all, pretty much a lot of this has coincided with sort of the rise in views in the late 1800s, early 1900s, based on the kind of folks who were immigrating here throughout the beginnings of America into power, into positions of power and wealth. And with the kind of changes that have taken place in terms of the 1800s, with the Civil War, with the rise of some indications that there was a rise in opioid usage after, shortly after that, there was the beginnings of Chinese immigration to the West Coast, and the country really then started changing, because as that immigration started, the famine in Ireland had taken place, European immigration had started increasing from certain countries, and that was a trend that would only really continue and increase. So I think that the country started changing a lot, from my understanding, especially between 1850 and say 1920, and the demographics of the country were changing a lot. And a lot of the laws that came up, and this is not unique to the United States, this is unfortunately true of a lot of countries, but the initial usage in many instances was not the problem for regulators. The problem for regulators was when it was either undesirable populations or they saw it as a risk to effectively their own kids. And that's when it seems that the beating of the drum gets loud enough for some kind of change to happen. And, in the early 1900s, I had author Caroline Acker of the book. She's a historian and author of the book Creating the American Junkie, and her whole research focuses on the time period from roughly 1870, 1880 into the early 1900s, looking at those kind of social questions. So yeah, I think that there was a lot going on the demographic change, so that would force outlook changes on one hand, but also in terms of evolution of medicine, our understanding of psychiatry, our understanding of rationality. There was just a lot, even philosophically, whatnot. There were a lot of changes culminating at that point. And yeah, I think the US could have gone a very different way. We had a number of points where we almost did. Similar, I know, in Mexico and many other countries, but we just chose to have a much more prohibitionist and moralistic mindset, which just history has showed us time and time again that does not work. So going back to Edward's question, I think that, we don't even necessarily need to open it up and make drug use super easily available for everyone. But at the very least, we need to start rethinking of our current policy doesn't work. So even if we don't just open up the floodgates, how do we innovate and experiment here in a way that we optimize towards less people dying? For me, I just think the ultimate goal needs to be less death, just because it's been a horrifying trend we've seen.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Eugene. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. We are going to have to end right now. We're a little before the 40-minute mark, but because we got started late, we're going to just cut it a few minutes early. Thanks, everyone, and I will see you at some sessions later in the day.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.